Hi, everybody. A very warm welcome to the Antognazza lecture, which is sponsored by the British Society for the History of Philosophy, the BSHP. My name's Susan James, and I became chair of the BSHP last spring. This was in the saddest of circumstances, shortly after the terribly premature death of Maria Rosa Antognazza. Rosa, for whom this lecture is named, was, of course, a brilliant and incredibly distinguished professor of philosophy here at KCL. But she was simultaneously an incomparable chair of the BSHP, someone who successfully promoted its national and international reputation right across the philosophical world. I won't try to list all the good things that Rosa did for the BSHP, except to say that one of her achievements was to set up funding schemes for students and early career researchers. It's a very great pleasure to see some of the people who won these fellowships here tonight. And maybe some of the rest of you will apply for them or point them out to your colleagues and students. I think that would have pleased Rosa very much and be a fitting addition to her legacy. So for a number of years, the BSHP has held an annual lecture. And we were very grateful to be able to express our admiration and affection and indebtedness to Rosa by renaming it the Antognazza Lecture. So this is the inaugural Antognazza Lecture. We're very glad that it's taking place here at KCL, which was, of course, Rosa's own institution, and one that she shared with her daughter, Francesca, who's here tonight. And we're also very delighted that it's being given by Peter Adamson, Professor of Ancient and Medieval Philosophy here, who was one of Rosa's very close colleagues. In addition to his position at KCL, as most of you know, Peter holds a joint appointment at the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, where he directs a project on Islamic natural philosophy. He is an extraordinarily learned student of the late ancient Arabic and medieval philosophical traditions, and he's done an enormous amount to broaden our knowledge of the history of philosophy, both through his own research, which includes, for example, monographs on Plotinus and Al-Kindi and Al-Razi, and also through his absolutely amazing podcast, The History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps. All historians of philosophy, and indeed I think all philosophers, are beneficiaries of this project and of Peter's extraordinary energy and creativity. So thank you, Peter, for agreeing to speak this evening. And on behalf of the BSHP, I'd like to invite Peter to give the inaugural Antognazza lecture, Thinking with Rosa, Assent in the Philosophy of the Islamic World.
Okay, so on occasions like this, it's obviously a tradition to say that one is honored to be here. And not only is that true on this occasion, but I think this is probably the most meaningful talk I've ever given for me in personal terms. As Susan just said, I was a friend and colleague of Rosa's. A lot of us here were friends and colleagues of Rosa's. And you know that she was a wonderful person, wonderful colleague, wonderful wife and mother, and also a wonderful philosopher, which is what I'm going to be talking about tonight. So this is a talk about Rosa's forthcoming book, which Howard's been preparing diligently for press. And the basic idea of the talk, just to give you a preview of what's to come, is that Rosa was an amazing historian of philosophy who knew more history of philosophy than is in any way feasible, right? So those of you who knew her even a little will know that her historical range was absolutely enormous. And probably even if you kind of knew what her historical range was, obviously she's especially known for her work on Leibniz, but you would have thought, oh, yeah, she does medieval philosophy, she does early modern, all over the place, right, whatever. But if you read this book, which is about to come out, then you would, almost no matter what you thought Rosa's historical range was, you would be pleasantly surprised that it was even bigger than you thought. So it goes all the way from even the pre-Socratics all the way up to actually the Oxford realists. So it's a massive, massive project, and that's the first third of the book. I'm very fortunate in that I have helped a little bit with the process of preparing it for press, but also even before that. So I think maybe something like 3 years ago, she sent me the historical section, and I sent her a few comments on it. So this is a project that I'm familiar with, that I've been kind of thinking about with her for a long time. And one thing that actually even my very first reading of that draft made me consider was, well, what if you applied Rosa's insights and ideas and hypotheses to kind of the one historical tradition that would have been relevant that she doesn't cover in the book, which is Islamic philosophy, because she didn't get around to learning Arabic. I don't know, some people, lazy. So I've actually been thinking about this for years, and I'm glad that this talk is giving me an opportunity to think about it a little bit more explicitly. But before I get to that, since most of you won't have had the benefit of reading this as yet unpublished book, I want to tell you a little bit about it. So perhaps this is not the clearest title, but it's kind of a wordplay on the title of the book. So Howard got the joke if no one else did. So her forthcoming book is called Thinking with Assent, Renewing a Traditional Account of Knowledge and Belief. And as I say, part of the book is historical in nature, and really the only part that I'm going to be engaging with tonight. So the traditional account that's mentioned in the title is something that's traditional in the sense that she finds it to be pervasive in ancient, medieval, and early modern philosophy, really going up quite far. So at least like Leibniz, Locke, and some other people whose names start with L, and maybe up to even the 19th century. So there's an interesting question also about, as it were, where things went wrong. And it's quite a provocative book in the sense that she does think that things have gone wrong. So she thinks that wherever the turn was, it was a turn in a bad direction, and that a lot of epistemology in the last, let's say, 100, 150 years is characterized by a certain approach which departs from what she's calling the traditional account, and she thinks is a worse idea. So, as I say, what I'm going to try to do here is kind of test her hypothesis by putting her claims to sort of as a question to a whole range of texts that she doesn't really discuss, and seeing whether her account holds up. So is this traditional account also traditional for the Islamic world? And spoiler alert, the answer is yes. So, I mean, actually, so I think one of the many tragedies that her departing us has brought is that, I mean, Rosa was a philosopher, right? And you're all philosophers, so you know that philosophers like it when you disagree with them, right? So we're not like normal humans. Normal humans like it when people agree with them. Philosophers like it when they say something and the other person says, no, I don't think so. And you can actually see, you've actually seen Rosa do this, right? Philosophers perk up and they say, oh, why not? And that's when we really get going. And I think it would be really wonderful to have seen people attack Rosa's book, or at least critically engage with it. And it would have been even more wonderful to see how Rosa would have responded, right? And in a way that puts me in an awkward position because I, at least for the third of the book that I'm competent to judge, the historical part, I totally think she's right. And in fact, in a way, the upshot of this talk is that it turns out that she's even more right than she thought she was, which I hope would also have made her happy, although I don't think it would have made her as happy as a really thundering denunciation of all of her central theses. Okay, so let's take a look at her position in this book. So I'm going to be, so modern day epistemologists, you're going to feel a little bit called out here, but it's not me doing it. It's Rosa. And also bear in mind that I'm skating very quickly over some things she does with great nuance and care in the book, just because I have to get where I'm going. Okay, but hopefully you'll recognize this as basically plausible. In modern day epistemology, there's an account which she in the book calls the standard account as opposed to the traditional account, according to which knowledge is a kind of belief. So the thought would be that we have lots of beliefs. Some of them have kind of everyday status, like you just believe something. And then some of them have a kind of gold standard status, which is that you know something. Obviously, one difference would be that the great mass of your beliefs include some false beliefs, whereas none of your knowledge includes false beliefs, right? Because knowledge can't be false, whereas beliefs can. But that's not the only difference, right? Because clearly some true beliefs aren't knowledge either. So that suggests that what we need to do is add something to beliefs to get to knowledge. So sometimes people call this the JTB plus account of knowledge. So you have a belief, that's B. It has to be true, right? Because obviously none of the false beliefs are knowledge. And then maybe you have justification, right? So justification sounds like a good idea. Let's add a justification. And O, Gettier problems. So we need something other than justification because sometimes justified true beliefs arguably aren't knowledge. So there's something else, and that's the plus, right? As I said, this is kind of hand-wavy and quick, but hopefully you all recognize it. So the idea is that mere beliefs and knowledge are a dichotomous division of beliefs. And in the face of this, in the face of difficulties to explain exactly what has to be added apart from truth to a belief to make it knowledge, other approaches have developed. So one she talks about is Williamson's knowledge first approach. So the idea here, I'm like very far from being the person in this room who knows the most about this, so please don't ask me questions about this. I will refer you to David Papineau or somebody. But there's this knowledge first approach, which at least Rosa says in the book is something like treating, so you sort of take knowledge as primary rather than taking beliefs as primary, and then you sort of try to understand what a belief is in terms of knowledge, rather than trying to understand what knowledge is in terms of belief. So you kind of flip it around, is the idea. So for example, you treat, a belief would be treating a proposition as if you knew it, even though maybe you know that you don't know it, right? Sort of acting on it as if you knew it. So this idea has a slogan, which is knowledge first. And Rosa adopts this slogan for her own project and says that in a sense, the traditional account was also a knowledge first approach because knowledge does have a privileged status in the traditional epistemology, but it's very different because rather than sort of starting from knowledge and thinking of belief as some kind of demoted version of knowledge, and rather than the standard account where you start with belief and try to promote it to knowledge, rather you think that knowledge and belief relate more the way that, for example, smelling and dreaming do. In other words, they're kind of similar, but fundamentally they don't have anything in common. Okay? So whatever they have in common is extremely generic. For example, something like they're both mental states or cognitive attitudes or ways of endorsing something. The umbrella term that she uses for both is assent. So they're both forms of assent. But not only are they not versions of each other, neither is a version of the other one, but they are mutually exclusive. So if you believe P, you cannot also know P, and vice versa. So notice how different this is from the JTB account, right? So as I said, in this picture, knowledge is just a subset of belief. On her version, what she's reconstructed as the traditional account, I'll just read out what she says. Knowing and believing are distinct in kind in the strong sense that they're mutually exclusive mental states. The same cognitive subject cannot simultaneously and in the same respect be in a state of both knowing and believing the same thing. okay? And this might sound kind of counterintuitive, right? Because you might think, as a kind of standard, ordinary English language user, if I know that Charles is now the king, I don't know, being in England made that example leap to mind, I guess, then I think most English language speakers would say, well, I also do believe that Charles is the king. And she's saying that until very recently in the history of philosophy, at least when people were being careful with their words, they would have denied that. So you can believe it or you can know it, but not both. And she sometimes, to kind of capture the difference, says that knowledge, unlike believing, is sort of like seeing. So it's like an immediate grasp in a way that believing isn't. And because I'm talking about Rosa, I had to have at least one quote from Aquinas. So I'm just giving you the quote that she gives, which is that he says, the reason why the same thing cannot simultaneously and in the same respect be known and believed is that what is known is seen, whereas what is believed is not seen. So this is a very powerful illustration that at least Aquinas both agrees with her about the mutual exclusivity idea, and also likes this idea, and maybe in a way she takes it from him, right, that knowledge is like seeing. But it's not just Aquinas. So it's a whole bunch of other people, so these are just a few of the people that she discusses in the book. So as I say, she talks about a wide range of ancient philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, Hellenistic philosophers. She talks about Neoplatonism a little bit. She talks about medieval philosophy, of course, especially Aquinas. She talks about Descartes, Locke, Hume, Kant. Of course, she talks about Leibniz. And I mean, from my point of view as a specialist in ancient and medieval philosophy, these guys, like Kant and Leibniz, they are like yesterday, right? But she even goes up as far as the Oxford Realists. So this is really, as I said, very wide-ranging. And basically what she's trying to do is show you that this isn't just kind of a quirky idea that you can find in Aquinas. It's actually just this as the old standard view. So it's what used to be the standard view until what is now the standard view took over. Now, this contrast between knowledge and belief, especially when you say, well, knowledge is like seeing and believing isn't. So you might think, well, what this shows is that belief is something that you're forced to do when you don't have knowledge, right? So knowledge would be, as I said before, the gold standard, and belief is kind of a second best thing. But really what we would like is if we could turn all of our cognitive states that are beliefs into knowledge, right? This is actually, in a way, I mean, I think this is an idea that you would find in some pre-modern philosophers. So, for example, the Stoics, I take it, thought that the game of philosophy is to put yourself in the position of the person they called the sage. And the sage is someone who never makes mistakes because they never assent to propositions unless they know them to be true. Okay, so all their beliefs are knowledge, as we would put it. But what Rosa would say is, no, no, no. It's not that all their beliefs are knowledge, it's that they don't have any beliefs. They only have knowledge. Where they don't have knowledge, they suspend judgment. Right? That's what the Stoic sage would do. Funny example, when a Stoic was presented with some wax fruit and tried to eat it, and then mocked for being tricked into eating wax fruit, even though he had the ambition of being a Stoic sage, he said, I did not assent to the proposition that it was fruit. I assented to the proposition that it looked like fruit. There's also a lot of examples in this Stoic discussion about things like matching eggs and identical twins. And since I have an identical twin, I've always enjoyed these examples quite a lot. For all you know, Glenn Adamson is giving this talk, right? So here you've all been sitting there assenting to the proposition that you're listening to Peter Adamson, and you shouldn't have been. If you were Stoic sages, you would have been like, I'm suspending judgment about his giving this talk. Although the fact that I seem to know a lot about, hopefully seem to know about a lot about philosophy would be sort of hopefully like edging you towards the conclusion that I'm Peter and not Glenn. If I do start talking a lot about art history, though, that'll be a tip-off. Okay, so you might think, okay, so what Rosa's trying to tell us is that people used to think that knowledge was awesome and that belief sort of sucks, and so you should prefer knowledge. But that's not her view, and she doesn't think that that's the view of most of the people she covers. Actually, I would have loved to ask her about the Stoics, given what I just said. But she thinks that belief is incredibly important. So she has like a second slogan that she pairs with the knowledge first slogan. So she says, knowledge first, but give belief its due. And what she means by that is that in many contexts, and one that she explores a lot in the book, is religious belief. In many contexts, knowledge is just not available. So think about the fact that you can't see God in this life. Maybe you can do it in the beatific vision, but according to people like Aquinas, you can, in this life, only have beliefs about God, at least some features of God, like, let's say, his Trinitarian nature might not be something that you can know in the sense of seeing it until you experience the beatific vision. And so this is why there's a whole chunk of her book where she talks about religious belief. And this is her sort of playing out the importance of belief. So, as she says, a crucial part of our successful cognition is constituted by justified belief, which tracks truth if and when knowing is out of one's cognitive reach. But notice again, her idea here is, well, there's two kinds of cases. There's cases where you can have knowledge, and then you should try to have knowledge. And then there's cases where you can have belief, and then you should try to have justified true belief. But don't go thinking that you can turn these ones into these ones, because they're two different cognitive states, right? Now, this is going to become important later. That's not to say that you cannot have knowledge and belief of the same proposition, right? So, for example, you can believe now that God is a Trinity, and you can see it in the afterlife, in the beatific vision, and then you'll have knowledge of the same proposition, right? So the claim is not that the objects of knowledge and belief are mutually exclusive. The claim is that the mental states, the forms of assent, are mutually exclusive, okay? As you're going to see, that's going to be important later on. Okay, so now we come to my part. So this is my favorite footnote in the book. So I took a screenshot of it. So this is not me, this is Rosa. So this is a footnote 12 in, I forget which chapter. Tasdiq, which means assent or literally deeming something true, is a technical term used in Arabic philosophy from Al-Farabi, dates, onwards, to indicate affirming a proposition. On tasdiq, and its contrast with tasawwur, which is usually translated conceptualization, see Deborah Black, 1998, I am grateful to Peter Adamson for drawing my attention to the notion of assent in the Islamic tradition. Thank you, Rosa. Okay, so the rest of this talk is about this footnote. I'm not making that up. This is really what the rest of the talk is about. So, this is something I talked about with Rosa. I said, oh, it's interesting that you're using the word assent as your bridging, as your kind of umbrella term for both knowledge and belief, because assent is actually a really important word in Arabic philosophy, and I think that they use it in the same way to bridge both knowledge and belief, but I also think that your traditional account also turns up in the Islamic tradition. In other words, I also think that they use tasdeeq for knowledge and for belief, and these are mutually exclusive cognitive states. But I'm not sure. I had to think about it. And she responded to that by writing this footnotes. And so what I want to do now is basically explain to you that I've thought about it and that it's true. I believe that it's true. Okay, so the crucial term here is indeed tasdeeq. So I won't bore you with how Arabic works, but actually it's kind of interesting. So in Arabic, most words come from 3 root letters, which are then modified by adding more letters and vowels to give you different words, right? So like sidq means truth, and tasdeeq means to affirm that something is true, or to assent, right? So this literally, tasdeeq, literally just means to deem something true, okay? Or the deeming of something as true. And as it says in the footnote, there's a traditional contrast that comes in with Al-Farabi and then becomes pervasive in all of Arabic philosophical literature between tasdeeq and tasawwur. So again, so here the 3 crucial letters are s, aspirated S, a W, and an R. So for example, the word surah is the word for form, so that's how they translate Greek fans, that's how they translate eidos into Arabic. and tasawwur means something like forming, therefore, but we usually translate it as conception. And we've been doing some work in Munich on this and other topics in Avicen and philosophy. So I wanted to say that I've been working on this with Dustin Klinger, and I should sort of say that some of what I'm about to say is based on things we figured out together. But the thinker who introduced the terminology was not me and it was not Dustin Klinger, it was Farabi. So let me give you a nice passage where he explains this. Knowledge is of two types, conception and assent, tasawwur and tasdiq. Each of these may be either complete or deficient. Complete assent is the same as certainty, while complete conception is conceptualizing something in a way that encapsulates the thing's essence, namely that the thing be conceptualized in terms of what is signified by its definition. Now we can build on these two ideas to explain what we precisely mean by complete assent. We say that assent in general is when a human holds that something is the case and accordingly judges that the existence of that thing outside the mind is in accord with what is held in the mind. Truth, then, is when the thing outside the mind is in fact in accord with what is held in the mind. And certainty is when we hold about that to which the assent applies that it cannot at all be otherwise than we hold it to be. So that's quite a mouthful. And what is he talking about here? Well, I think what he's actually, well, if you look at the first sentence, that's quite straightforward. Knowledge is of two types, conception and assent. So already we have something funny going on here, which is that the highest level concept looks like it's knowledge. That's right, knowledge first, maybe. And knowledge doesn't look like it's, in general, going to be a species of belief. In fact, I think we can rule that out immediately, because some kinds of knowledge are conceptions. And he explicitly says that knowledge is either conception or assent. Clearly, beliefs are on the assent side, so there are some forms of knowledge that are not assents, right? The basic idea here is to just know what something means, right? So if you have a conception of human, for Farabi, that counts as knowledge. You might be tempted to cash that out in terms of beliefs to some propositions, but the point of this theory is that you shouldn't, right? So the idea is that when you have a conception of something, that's a sui generis kind of knowledge. It's not an assent. It's not deeming true any proposition. It's just grasping something, grasping like the meaning of a word, perhaps. He also, and here I can say something a little bit more rigorous about what conception is. He also, in the passage we just looked at, talks about grades of assent and conception, or how complete they are. So not every conception is complete, not every assent is complete. What is it for a conception to be complete or incomplete? Well, a complete conception is, if you go back, where is it? Oh, complete conception is conceptualizing something in a way that encapsulates the thing's essence. I'm probably literally the last person in the room who saw the relevant sentence, right? Because I'm too close to the screen. Anyway, so what does that mean? Well, it means that you've grasped a concept through a definition, right? So you know, for example, that human is rational animal, and that is a grasp of what human is. Again, you might have been tempted to cash that out as an assent, right? I even said it's grasping that human is rational animal, but that's just a paraphrase in propositional form of what's going on. What you've in fact done is you've grasped human sort of as rational animal, so you've grasped the definition. But not all conceptions work like that. So for example, I could have a conceptualization of human as the things in this room listening to this talk and other things that are similar, right? Not a great definition of human, and certainly not a definition of the essence of human. So this is what Aristotelians would call a nominal definition. So a nominal definition is when you grasp something under an accidental description. So another example would be, even if you grasp humans under using what's called a proper accident or a necessary accident. So suppose that you grasp human as the animal that laughs, that's true. Animals that can laugh that's extensionally identical to human, but it's not the real definition of human, so it only counts as a nominal definition. You would still, though, have successfully conceptualized human by grasping human as animal with the capacity to laugh. I noticed that the medievalists are nodding and the ancient people are looking puzzled, which is an interesting datum, and I'm looking forward to finding out why in the Q&A. Okay, although MM kind of frowns all the time when she's listening to talk, so it's hard to know how much to read into that. Okay, so you can have complete and incomplete conception. Now, there's an additional confusing thing here, which is that you can also have conceptions of whole propositions. So almost always when Farabi, Avicenna, and post-Avicennan philosophers talk about conceptions, they give you examples of single terms that you conceptualize, like human, animal, able to laugh, right? But they do also say that you could just understand what a proposition means or a sentence means, right? So, for example, the sentence, King Charles is at Buckingham Palace is a proposition about which I have no belief at the moment. I mean, I A, don't know where he is, and B, don't care where he is. I mean, I'm not trying to, there's not anti-royalist propaganda necessarily, I'm just saying I don't particularly care where he is. So I don't have an assent either to that proposition or its negation, but I know what it means, right? Or you might wonder, wonder where King Charles is tonight. What's he up to? Good old King Charles. So there you're sort of entertaining a proposition. You might even be wondering whether it's true, but you're not assenting. So long as you're not deeming true, your attitude towards the proposition should be conceptualization, okay? This is just a footnote to avoid confusion, okay? It's not really going to play any role in what follows, I don't think. Okay, so that's pretty simple, grades of completeness with respect to conceptualization. What about more and less complete assent? Well, I won't go all the way back, but in the passage you might remember that he talks about different levels of completeness with respect to assent. And he says that the kind of best kind of assent would be assent that involves certainty. So to understand what he means there, we might turn to another short work that he wrote, which has been the subject of a nice study by Deborah Black, which is called On the Conditions of Certainty, the Shara'it al-Yaqin. And it's pretty short. It's like maybe 10, 15 pages long. And what he does is he says, well, certainty comes in degrees, and it can be more or less complete, just like he said about assent in the previous passage. Remember, by the way, that he thinks assent is a kind of knowledge, okay? That's what we've seen so far. And knowledge can be complete or incomplete, right? The assent that is knowledge can be complete or incomplete. So it makes sense that he would say that certainty, certain assent, can be complete or incomplete. And he then gives you this list of conditions. Like I said, the title of the work is On the Conditions of Certainty. And he says there are 6 of them, 6 conditions. If all 6 are satisfied, then the assent is completely certain. So here's the conditions. First of all, you must hold of something that it is such and such. So what that means, that's just tasdeeq, right? That's deeming true the proposition that S is P. You might think, well, that's kind of odd. Like, why does it have to be that something is such and such? Why couldn't it be some other form of a proposition? And the answer is, he's an Aristotelian, so he's thinking about predications always. So he's working within a predicative logic. So he's always interested in sentences and propositions of the form S is P. So you have to, in addition to holding that it's the case, you have to say that it's the case because it agrees with the world outside. That's the kind of standard for truth, correspondence theory of truth. And you have to know that it corresponds. You don't have to, it's not enough to assent that it corresponds. You have to know that it corresponds. And it must be impossible that the thing not correspond. that's interesting, right? So it has to be not just true, but necessarily true. There has to be no time at which it does not correspond. It has to be eternally true. And finally, it has to be an essential predication and not an accidental predication. Okay? So for example, suppose that there are no giraffes in Antarctica. There never have been and there never will be. You knew giraffes were coming at some point. Here they are. Will not be the last you'll see of the giraffes, actually. So suppose that you believe that there are no giraffes in Antarctica. And suppose the world is eternal and that there never have been any giraffes in Antarctica, there never will be. Well, that you could satisfy everything up to condition 6, but you'd fall at hurdle 6 because it's only accidentally true of giraffes that they're not in Antarctica. Those of you who are fans of Aristotle's posterior analytics will know that these conditions are drawn directly from Aristotle. So especially the telltale thing is especially 5 and 6. So Aristotle also says that knowledge in the strict and proper sense is always of propositions that are always true, or also 4. Is always of propositions that are necessarily true, always true, and essentially true. Obviously, there's a very restricted range of things you can know in that completely certain sense. So all 6 propositions to be satisfied, this is something that I couldn't, for example, you couldn't have knowledge like this that Peter Adamson's giving a talk, not just because I have an identical twin, but because I'm not necessarily giving a talk, I'm not always giving a talk, thank God, and I'm not essentially giving a talk. Again, thank God, that would be weird, right? Sort of came out of my mother like, and Aristotle said, in the posterior analytics. Okay, so now we come to the crux of the matter. And it's sort of brought up by even the first proposition, or the first condition. So the first condition was, well, you have to think that it's true, right? By the way, sorry, but I think there's a mistake here. I think I made a copy and paste. I think condition 2 is that it must correspond with the external existence. So it's not that you agree that it corresponds, it's that it in fact corresponds. So it's a fact of the matter that the proposition is true. So sorry about that, but condition 2 is just that it's true. So 1 is you think it's true, 2 is that it is true, with the correspondence theory of truth. Sorry about that. But the main point is that the first thing was you have to agree that it's true, and that's just tasdik, right? But that would clearly be a very incomplete form of certainty, right? So in particular, it's consistent with the proposition even being false, right? So maybe I think that it's true. I think that King Charles is at Buckingham Palace, but he's not, right? So it looks like there are versions of tasdik where you do not have knowledge, even though we said way back here that knowledge is divided into conception and assent, right? So here's what we should say about, and by the way, interestingly, if you look at the literature on this, sometimes people even translate tasdik as belief rather than assent. So you might think what Farabi meant is that, yes, knowledge is divided into conception and assent, but also assent is divided into knowledge and belief, right? So just as some kinds of knowledge are assents and some of them are conceptions, so some kinds of beliefs would be knowledge, but not all of them, right? So we'd actually have something like the standard account. And I've been kind of skating around this in my translations. This is kind of sneaky what I've been doing, but you might see that I'm using the verb to hold sometimes. So like here, when a human holds that something is the case, but you might have thought, well, I could have written someone believes that something is the case. And in fact, this word i'tikad, which I've been translating as holding that something is the case, is also sometimes translated as belief, right? So actually, from everything I've just said, it might be that Farabi, far from being proof or a good example for Rosa's thesis, he might actually be a counterexample, because he might be saying, okay, leave conception aside. Maybe conception is always knowledge, maybe not. But when it comes to assent, of course, some examples of knowledge are assents, but also that we have beliefs. So assent is also divided into two. There's knowledge and belief, right? And now we don't know whether the idea here is that assent means belief and is divided into mere belief and knowledge, as the standard account now would have it, or whether assent means assent in Rosa's terms, and is just an umbrella word for both belief, all belief, and knowledge. Does that make sense? You see what I'm saying? Okay. So, you might even think, oh, actually, isn't this list proof that Farabi holds the standard account and not the traditional account? Because it looks like he says you start by having a belief, and then you add some conditions until you ramp it up to be knowledge, right? So this is actually a JTB plus theory, right? So 1 gives you the B, it's a belief. 2 gives you the truth. And then you add the rest. You don't add justification, but you add some other things like necessity and eternity, essentiality. So here the idea then would be that tasdeeq should actually be translated as belief. It should come in two kinds, mere belief and knowledge, and therefore Farabi is thinking just like a modern-day epistemologist. Now, against this, notice that he actually qualifies the lesser forms of tasdeeq as incomplete certainty and incomplete knowledge. He doesn't seem to be tempted to say, well, you start with beliefs, and then at some point they become knowledge. He talks always in terms of complete and incomplete versions of the same thing. Complete knowledge versus incomplete knowledge. Complete certainty as opposed to incomplete certainty. So that's already kind of a warning sign that this may not be what he's thinking. And in fact, Rosa points out that some early modern philosophers like Leibniz held that there are degrees of knowledge. So saying that knowledge is like seeing doesn't tell you that knowledge is seeing something completely. Right? You could see something, but only partly. Right? Maybe you, in the beatific vision, maybe God still kind of holds back some secrets from you. God is infinite, you can't know him fully, but you get to see that he's a Trinity, but you don't find out what his favorite ice cream flavor is, or something. So you don't get everything about God. You only get some of it. So you could have degrees of knowledge, even if you have this traditional account where knowledge is strictly exclusive from belief. Now, I think it's actually hard to tell what Farabi thinks about this, so I want to turn to someone who worked all this out much more robustly and in more detail, who is Avicenna. Ibn Sina, but I'll call him Avicenna. So, like Farabi, he distinguishes knowledge into conception and assent, and like Farabi, he gives you different grades or ranks or degrees of assent. So he says that there are some assents where you're certain, and part of what it means, at least to be certain, is that you have a second order belief about maybe I shouldn't say belief, sorry. You have a second order assent that your assent is certainly true, right? So you assent to 2 + 2 = 4, and you also assent to the proposition that the proposition 2 + 2 = 4 is certainly true, okay? You assent to both, first level and second level. There's another kind where you have an uncertain assent, and you just haven't thought about whether it's certain or not, right? So you're just kind of assenting to it without reflecting very hard on whether you're sure. And he says, he actually subdivides this. He says, in some cases, if you thought about it, you would see that you believe that it's true, and in some cases you would find out that you believe that it's false or that you're not sure on reflection. And then the third kind is what happens when you reflect on an uncertain assent and you decide that it is uncertain. So, for example, my friend tells me that I keep calling him Prince Charles, that King Charles is at Buckingham Palace, but I know that my friend is very unreliable, and so even though maybe I assent to the proposition, I'm kind of open to the idea that maybe King Charles is not at Buckingham Palace. And he says, by the way, that these correspond to the different kinds of discourse that are described in Aristotle's logic. So the first thing, where you have certainty and also certainty that you're certain, is demonstrative knowledge. The second thing is what you get in dialectic and sophistry, and the third is what you get in rhetoric. And by the way, he also says something interesting about poetry, which is that poetry produces no assent at all. So if someone gives you a poetic metaphor, the effect of that is to make you entertain a proposition without assenting to it. So remember I mentioned before that you can conceptualize propositions with whole propositions, not only singular terms. That's what happens when someone gives you a poetic metaphor. You just, oh, okay. Yeah, maybe your love is like a rose, but it doesn't convince you. It just gets you to think about it, according to Avicenna. Okay, so now let's go back to our central question. Is assent just belief? And does it divide into mere belief and knowledge? Well, Rosa liked to say on these questions of terminology, call them what you like. Doesn't matter which words we use. So what we need to do is focus on the philosophical issue. And the philosophical issue is really about the relationship between complete or certain or demonstrative assents and incomplete, uncertain, non-demonstrative assents. So the question is whether these are the same kind of mental state, namely belief, and the complete ones are just the incomplete ones that have something added to them, that turn the mere beliefs into knowledge. That would align their position with what Rosa sees as the standard account in modern day epistemology. If Rosa is right, what they should say is, no, 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 no. Complete demonstrative assent is mutually exclusive with incomplete non-demonstrative assent. So these are completely different mental states or mental attitudes. They're completely different kinds of assent which are non-overlapping. Okay? So you wouldn't say that there's all my beliefs and then some of them are knowledge, the ones that have been appropriately made rigorous or something like that. What you would say is, well, here are my assents, here are the beliefs, and here is the knowledge. If Rosa is right, that's what they should say. And so the question is really whether complete assent and incomplete assent are somehow like two versions of the same kind of mental state, right? So ultimately, in a way, we kind of come down here to philosophy of mind. So it turns out that there's very strong reason to think that Avicenna says what Rosa would expect him to say, namely that these things are mutually exclusive. So, giraffe. So, following Aristotle and Farabi, Avicenna thinks that knowledge is always about what, as Farabi said with his conditions 4, 5, and 6, is always about propositions that hold essentially universally, eternally. You can't have knowledge of a proposition like King Charles is at Buckingham Palace or Hiawatha the giraffe is having lunch. That's not to say that there's no sense in which you can have knowledge of a particular, but when you do that, what it means is you have some kind of universal knowledge, necessary, essential knowledge, and then you see that it applies to a particular. So for example, if I know that all giraffes are herbivores, and I see with my senses or remember that Hiawatha is a giraffe, then I can sort of put those two things together and infer that Hiawatha is a herbivore, but I don't have, as it were, scientific knowledge that Hiawatha is a herbivore. I've pointed out elsewhere, actually at a talk I once gave in London, that Avicenna has this famous claim that God doesn't have any knowledge of particulars as such. And in this paper I said, well, that's because there's no such thing as knowledge of particulars as such. We don't have knowledge of particulars as such either. What we have is knowledge of universal essential truths, eternal truths, and then we can use our senses and memory and imagination to kind of access particulars and apply the universal knowledge to the particular case. So for Avicenna, the puzzle was not the knowledge part, it was how does God apply his universal knowledge to particulars? And he has a story about that, which we don't need to get into. But the point is that even God knows like this, with this kind of hardcore kind of knowledge, which is not in any way a kind of belief. So actually, Rosa has a nice bit about Aristotle, where she says this about him. Judgment, or taking to be true, in the Greek there is hypolepsis, is the generic cognitive mode under which Aristotle groups more specific cognitive modes, including episteme, which means knowledge, and doxa, which means belief. Aristotle's episteme, knowledge, is not a matter of having justified true beliefs. If anything, as a grasp of demonstrations or as an explanatory capacity, episteme is closer to understanding than to justified true belief. And I was very excited when I reread the book and found this, Rosa saying this, because I had just been reading up on what people say about tasdik and tasawwur in Arabic. And so I had just read someone named Yop Lemaire saying that he was trying to track down what the Greek sources were for the Arabic concepts of tasdik and tasawwur. And he said, oh, there's a passage in posterior analytics which uses the verb hupolambane, which is related to hypolepsis, right? And that's the passage where tasdik came from. So I was really tickled to see that Rosa says, I mean, this isn't my paraphrase of Rosa, this is a direct quote from her book. And she says, taking to be true, hypolepsis. So she saw that that's tasdik, right? Because tasdik just means taking something to be true, deeming it to be true. So I thought that was pretty cool. This, by the way, is the passage from the posterior analytics. Okay, so, and then I thought, well, actually what Rosa's saying here about Aristotle's Greek, try to look at the passage and remember it as well as you can. I'll give you all 10 seconds. Memorize the passage. Ready? Go. You have 5 seconds left. Okay. Same passage, a little shorter, with Arabic technical terms instead of Greek technical terms. It's exactly the same, except for the technical terms. Judgment, or taking to be true, tasdik, and they do use the word judgment, hukm, as a synonym sometimes for tasdik, is a generic cognitive mode under which Avicenna groups more specific cognitive modes, including not episteme and doxa, but ilm and zan, knowledge and belief. Avicenna's ilm, which is knowledge, or what for Aristotle was episteme, is not a matter of having justified true beliefs. If anything, as a grasp of demonstrations, it's closer to understanding. So again, the thought here is that when I have demonstrative knowledge, that's a form of tasdik, which is completely different from the form of tasdik that I have when I have a belief. Okay? And so we shouldn't translate tasdik as belief. I mean, as Rosa says, call them what you like, but I think it would be right to translate tasdik not as belief, but as knowledge, because that helps us, not as belief, but as assent, as is usually done, because that clues us in that there are some forms, some cases of assent, which are knowledge, and some which are belief, and never the twain shall meet, okay? Just as in Aristotle. Objection, and this goes back to something I said before, couldn't you have a mere belief that giraffes are herbivores, right? The same proposition could be believed that you know on a different occasion, or maybe, so here's Susan the giraffologist, and there's little old me who's a big fan of giraffes but has never studied giraffes. So I believe that giraffes are herbivores, but sadly I think that means that they eat herbs, right? Rather than that they're vegetarians. Whereas Susan really knows that giraffes are herbivores, right? So I have a belief of a proposition that she has knowledge of. And the same person could on one occasion have mere belief of something, and another occasion have knowledge of it. So don't they have to overlap, you might think? Doesn't it have to be the case that you start out by believing things, and then somehow you get to know them? Isn't that how it works? Isn't that how science is? And the answer is no, actually. Because the question is, how did you get to the tasdik? What road of process got you there? If it was demonstration, or grasping a first principle, but leaves that aside. If it was demonstration, then the tasdik is knowledge. If it's any other way of getting to the assent, then it's a belief. In either case, it's an assent because you've deemed something to be true, but the mechanism, or maybe not mechanism, but the process by which you got to the assent determines whether it's knowledge or belief. So for sure, you could believe something, right? So Susan tells me and maybe explains to me briefly that giraffes are herbivores. And I was like, that's interesting. And you know what? Susan, like, her giraffologist life is amazing. She jets around the world to all these giraffe conferences, gets to hang around with giraffes, knit them scarves. It's brilliant, right? So I would like to become a giraffologist as well. And so I go off and become a giraffologist. But key thing here is that for Avicenna, as for Aristotle, you wouldn't do that by like starting with your belief that giraffes are herbivores and doing something to that belief. You kind of throw it out and start over. How would you start over? Well, you'd have to somehow produce an Aristotelian demonstration. It's a long story about how that would work. It might depend on the subject matter, but it wouldn't be by taking your belief and reinforcing it in some way. Now, so I think actually that's already probably enough to show that Rosa's hypothesis applies pretty well to Avicenna, but there's an even stronger reason, which is, and now we really are into philosophy of mind, although maybe not the kind of philosophy of mind that a lot of people here do. So Avicenna is a very committed dualist. So he thinks that the rational soul is an immaterial power which uses no bodily organ and can in fact survive the death of the body. And, maybe unusual thing, he thinks that this immaterial power, the rational soul, he also calls it the intellect, is only capable of one function, which is to know intelligibles. That's all that it does. It doesn't remember, it does not engage in sense perception, it does not engage in practical reasoning. It just grasps intelligibles. All it does is know. In fact, when you die, the only thing you'll be able to do still is know. And you'll only be able to know the things that you knew in this life because you learned them. So if you didn't do any philosophy and science, there will be nothing for you to do. So you should absolutely do philosophy. So it's good that you're all philosophers. When you know something, Avicenna says, what that means is that you receive the form of the intelligible in your intellect. What exactly he means by that is a whole other matter, but the point is that it's something that only the immaterial intellect can do. But this is not the only kind of cognition you're capable of. You're also capable of something that he calls thinking, as well as imagination, memory, sensation, and so on. Thinking is, unlike intellection, not an immaterial power. It's actually seated in the brain. In fact, he even tells you which part of the brain it's seated in. It's in the middle. So you can see mine really well, actually. And the two things are very different. So not only is one realized immaterially and the other realized physically, but intellection doesn't require time and thinking does. This is a lot like if for Neoplatonism fans, and I know there are some in the room, Neoplatonism fans, this is like the difference between noesis and dianoia, okay? So this, by the way, is a medieval image of the brain-centered powers recognized by Avicenna. Good example of how influential Avicenna was in the Latin-speaking world. So Avicenna here is affirming what I have, in reference to another philosopher named Al-Kindi, elsewhere called a bifurcated epistemology, which is not a very nice word. I was actually trying to grope for, in a way, what Rosa's point is in her book. So what I was trying to say is, well, there are some cognitive powers that gives you knowledge, there are some that give you belief, and they're very different even in ontological terms, right? One is realized non-physically, the other is realized physically. And in fact, that's even how Avicenna proves that the rational soul is immaterial. He says, if the rational soul were in a body, when it received a form, it would particularize the body by like embedding it in the matter of the organ. And it can't do that. It can only, or it mustn't do that. It has to grasp it as a universal concept, the way God thinks, as we just saw before. And so it's actually pivotal to his proof, even of the immortality of the soul, that knowledge belongs to one very different kind of entity than belief does, because belief belongs to the brain, along with all other forms of lower cognition. So for example, your sensation is also in your brain, what gathers your sense data, your memory, all that stuff happens down in the brain. That's where beliefs happen, according to him. So this is, I think, in a way, Avicenna is even a stronger example of Rosa's thesis than a lot of the philosophers she considers, because he explicitly argues that knowledge and other, what we might call other forms of belief, but what we should call other forms of assent, Avicenna explicitly argues that knowledge and other forms of assent happen in two ontologically different kinds of metaphysical contexts or powers. So clearly, intellection and knowledge are mutually exclusive from other forms of assent. And last thing I want to say, and I'll be done. I've been talking this whole time about the knowledge first part of her thesis, right? That knowledge is very different from belief and has this special status in Avicenna. But actually, the second part of her sort of slogan, knowledge first, but give belief its due, is also something we can find in Avicenna, because he is very interested in assents that don't rise to the level of knowledge. In fact, he's unusually interested in this. He's a lot more interested in this than most of his predecessors, either in late Greek or early Arabic philosophy. And the reason he's interested in it is that he thinks that most people, and even philosophers, in order to kind of get along in society, need to have a lot of mere assents, i.e. beliefs, right? So one example he gives is that our ethical beliefs are assents that we have without knowing. And another example is that non-philosophers only assent by believing, not by knowing, to a whole bunch of religiously important things like God exists. So they're not philosophers, they can't prove it, but they better darn well believe it, right? Or you name it, right? So because he thinks this is very important, he gives you a kind of whole etiology, like an explanation of where these things come from, for these beliefs. We would be tempted to call them mere beliefs, but as we've seen, it's okay to just call them beliefs, right? So assents that are not knowledge. So he says, for example, you might just have testimony, and you might even feel certain about something through testimony, but of course that's not knowledge and intellection. That's a whole different ballgame, right? That's demonstrative knowledge that you arrive at by receiving an intelligible, or you go through the demonstration until you receive the intelligible in your rational soul, right? That's not what happens when someone tells you that something is true. In fact, Deborah Black, to mention her again, has talked about these kinds of premises that provide subjective certainty as Avicenna's social epistemology. And as I say, he even thinks that ethical principles fall into this category. So, like Rosa, Avicenna does put knowledge first, but he also gives belief its due. So the upshot of this is that actually Rosa's historical thesis passes this test with flying colors. If anything, Avicenna, maybe Farabi too, but I think definitely Avicenna, is a spectacularly good example for her thesis. And maybe even, and again, it would have been nice to talk to her about this, maybe even putting Avicenna into the picture more would explain why the late medieval, like Aquinas and so on, and maybe even beyond that to early modern, of course, they all read their Avicenna, right? So maybe this even helps to explain the particular form of the so-called traditional account of epistemology that we find in them. Obviously, I've only told you about two philosophers here. I haven't told you about all philosophy in the Islamic world, and we were talking about this at dinner, whether, for example, Islamic theologians in the so-called Kalam tradition would also ratify the tests, or ratify Rosa's historical hypothesis, but I kind of think they would. And I think that actually, I mean, I already thought this when I first read the book manuscript, but I especially think it now. One of the amazing things about the book is that it not only makes you sort of think of epistemology and also philosophy of religion in a new light, but even just the historical part, because it's a very fruitful idea, right? So what if knowledge and belief worked like this? What if they were two exclusive forms of assent? And I would never have seen Avicenna in this light that I've just presented without having read Rosa's book. So, and I think this is actually a good example of what good history of philosophy can do. It can make you see things that the author didn't even look at. Right? Okay, thanks very much.
Thanks, Peter. That was fantastic. So my name is Antognazza. I'm the chair, the head of department in the philosophy department. And you know, when I heard that the society had invited Peter to give the inaugural lecture, I was so excited because I couldn't imagine anyone better to understand the scope and breadth of Rosa's thought and her most recent book. And although she may have been, I'm sure, disappointed with your Assent, we certainly weren't.
Good.
So we have quite a bit of time still for questions. So the floor is open. Oh yes, and there's a mic that John is going to pour out.
Thank you so much, Peter. That was fascinating. I learned a lot in an area that I don't know well. I want to ask a question, and maybe it's partly asking Rosa for this, partly you. But I wonder if Rosa thinks, in addition to thinking that there is a standard account according to which knowledge and belief are mutually exclusive, does she, throughout this period of the history of philosophy, does she also think that the justification for this position remains stable across all these thinkers? Now I come to where this connects to what you were saying. So at least in relation to Plato himself, who is standardly taken to be someone who takes knowledge to be justified through belief. Mm-hmm. We know from Republic 5 that he actually also holds a second account, that is knowledge first account, where he says that knowledge and belief are as different as seeing and hearing. And he gives a justification which connects what you were saying. So his justification is that knowledge and belief are the exercise of mental powers. Powers are defined, and it's very interesting because it's the first explicit definition we get of the causal power in the history of philosophy, as to in relation to what they are set over and what they do. Different definition from Aristotle.
Yep.
Okay. But on that basis, then, they're different powers because they're set over different things, knowledge and belief, so they cannot mutually overlap and overlap.
Yeah.
Now, the justification you gave, according to Avicenna, reminded me of that. So you were saying there are two mental powers, they're metaphysically different, they're embodied differently, and you gave some account of that. Mm-hmm. So then the question arose for me, is the justification that we find in Plato something that goes across all the historical periods, and is the justification something that you see in common between the Islamic world as it presented to us and the classical world that Rosa explored?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Thank you.
I mean, okay, so I was sort of anticipating a lot of these questions might be questions Rosa could answer better than me, so Howard, jump in if I say something wrong. But, I mean, I think broadly speaking, the answer is yes. She thinks that they all have the same, maybe, intuitions, and that these intuitions are correct, and that they sort of run throughout the history of philosophy up to the early modern period. And the fundamental intuition is maybe that thing about seeing, right? So either you grasp something immediately or you don't, right? And if you don't, then you need to do something else. And I think that idea of knowledge as being intimate, and the intimacy and immediate, and the immediacy giving you absolute certainty, I think that that's something that runs throughout all of her candidates. And that, of course, could apply to both Plato and Aristotle, right? But as soon as you, and I mean, the reason why this part of the book is so long is that as soon as you get past that general, sort of generic commonality, things get very complicated. So for example, as I said, she talks about some thinkers who recognize grades of knowledge, just as Farabi recognizes grades of certainty, whereas others don't. Or to give another example, if you run this kind of dualist psychological story to explain why knowledge must be different from belief, that's obviously not going to work for materialists like Hobbes or the Stoics, but the Stoics also uphold the traditional account on Rosa's reason. Clearly, she's right about that as well. So I don't think that I don't think that what she's saying should be taken to imply that all of these thinkers have the same epistemology. That's clearly not right. It's more like there's two families of epistemologies. One is you've got all these beliefs, and then we want to know which of the beliefs are knowledge. The other is, there's assent, which is actually the kind of word that doesn't really pick out a natural kind, because it groups two very, very different things under it, right? Namely, knowledge and belief. And this is how people used to think. And then, of course, they all maybe work out in detail what exactly the difference is between knowledge and belief differently. But they all have the intuition that assent is internally bifurcated, right? As far as Plato goes, I mean, I would say that the middle of the Republic is a really good text for Rosa, but obviously not all of Plato is a good text for Rosa. And in fact, if you ever want to say that pre-modern philosophers were in general committed to X, you're always going to have the problem that Plato, right? Because even if you can find Plato having a character say X, you can almost surely find a character saying not X somewhere else. And so there's an interesting part of the book where she tries to argue that even the Meno, which looks, I mean, people always mention the Meno and teach it as if it were about a justified true belief theory. She tries to show that that's not a correct reading of the Meno. I can't reconstruct for you right here now what she does there, but it comes down to, you know, what it would be to have a reason of the cause, right? So the idea is not that that's not justification, right? That's sort of her move. So she thinks that even Plato, across the board, even the Theaetetus and Meno, is holding to the traditional account.
Could I come back briefly? Okay, sorry. Yes, thank you for that. What I was asking more precisely about was whether the justification to the view is stable across all these thinkers. And I was offering,
right.
sorry, I just was offering the thought that
sometimes they don't even.
powers, there are different causal powers because
Right.
of certain criteria, and that cuts across dualism and materialism. So
Yes, absolutely.
that's precisely the question.
Actually, I think Plato might be unusual in a way in giving an articulated justification. I think actually what I kind of got out of her book is that they don't normally justify it explicitly, because why would they? Because this is just what everybody thinks, right? It's sort of like, you know, when people say that proofs of God's existence are not there to make you believe in God, but to do something else, like make you understand something about God, because everyone believes in God, so like you're not trying to prove, I mean, that would be kind of a waste of time, right? And I think there's something similar going on here, except maybe even stronger, like they don't know what it would be to think that knowledge was a species of belief, right? In the sense that we mean that.
Hi, thank you. Dino Jakušić, University of Warwick. Thank you for the talk. Now, I wanted to ask you, now I don't have the access to the manuscript, so I can only work from the published papers on the topic. And so maybe this has been dropped by the time the manuscript was composed. But in the papers, Rosa talks not just about the distinction between knowing and believing, but also that knowing properly conceived has been and should again be understood analogous to seeing.
Right.
And you mentioned a little bit about seeing.
No, that's definitely still in there.
So, okay. So I wanted to ask you then, you know, when we look at Al-Farabi and Avicenna and, you know, people we talked about, do you find this metaphor or analogy of seeing? And do you find it in different terms which can be translated as knowing? Because I know, for example, in Wolf, you can find Antognazza's pictures very well, but if you go with seeing as well, then you get something he would not call knowing, right? So I don't know if you can expand on that.
Yeah, okay, so one thing is that, so people often say that nous and noein in Greek have something to do with seeing, right? And that's not true of the word eren, knowledge, and it's also not true of the word akal, which means intellect. Nor is it true, I guess, of ma'arifa, which is another word for knowledge. But on the other hand, they use a word a lot, which is nazar, which means usually inquiry in this context, and that's got a strongly visual connotation. So I don't know how much weight to put on that. Of course, Sufis love visual, not only Sufis, but also like there's this philosopher named Suhrawardi who seems to have had the idea that knowledge is like something being present to the soul the way that a visible object is present to the eye. So that would be a very strongly visual working out of the idea. But I don't think that Avicenna really leans into the visual language for knowledge. Nonetheless, throughout the whole Aristotelian tradition, because of Aristotle, I mean, Aristotle says in De Anima 3, I guess in 3:4, he says, well, knowing is going to be analogous to sensation. So what does that mean? Like, what are the implications of that? And it's a thoroughgoing assumption through the whole Aristotelian tradition that intellection as a mechanism or as a cognitive power has to have some kind of isomorphism to sensation. And one of the ways you see that in what I said is when he says that intellect is a power that receives a form. So you can see that that's in a sense modeled on the idea of receiving a visual form in the eye, right? So even if they don't cash that out in lots of visual language, it's always there as a background assumption.
I'm Cristina Chimisso. So I will, maybe there is a bit of a story more than a question, but your talk made me understand a discussion I had actually with Rosa better some time ago. So Rosa recently edited a special issue of the British Journal for the History of Philosophy on intuition.
Yeah, I have a paper in it, actually.
Yeah, and I've got a paper as well. So we discussed, so we're together there. And,
Great issue. Yeah.
And so when she read my paper, we chatted about it. So, and my paper, okay, I won't say what it is about specifically, but obviously about intuition, about part of it is about Gaston Bachelard. And we had a bit of a discussion, and I think maybe we were, now I understand, we were maybe talking a bit of sort of cross purposes. So on the one hand, Bachelard has got that distinction that you have expanded here, that Rosa has stressed, between what he calls opinion and knowledge, in a way very traditional. And it's interesting, opinion is doxa, is belief. Because another thing that we discussed many years ago with Rosa, that is also linguistic. In French and Italian, you don't have belief in this. Okay, so let's say opinion. So there are two different things. They're totally separated. They're not, there is a quotation, everybody actually quotes a pastor saying, Bachelard says, opinion thinks badly. It doesn't think at all. Of course, opinion is not about thinking, but okay, so that's in a way is very in line. On the other hand, though, he attacks intuition for him is just the source of error because it's immediate. So it was very interesting when you're talking about knowledge as seeing, because it's precisely what Bachelard attacks. You cannot reach knowledge by seeing without mediation. Mm-hmm. And that was what we discussed with Rosa. So my I shouldn't say my intuition, yeah, in another sense, my hunch. I wonder if the history of philosophy, maybe in the 20th century where we are, took a bit of a turn because these philosophers, Bachelard especially, but many others, take as exemplar of knowledge 20th century science, yeah, where the individual cannot gain knowledge by herself. So there is always a dialectic, there is always an error to be rectified. So he has to be always reflexive. 20th century knowledge, maybe also 19th century philosophy, but I don't know if you have a view about that.
Yeah, I mean, so obviously there's an interesting, if Rosa is right, it's obviously an interesting question, when and why do things go awry? But I think there is an earlier development which is maybe the ultimate root of the problem, which is that there's a kind of instability that emerges exactly for the reason you're mentioning, but earlier. So if you think about 17th century science, so again, I'm certainly not the person here who knows the most about 17th century science, but so there are these people who are still living in a society where the universities are dominated by a scholastic philosophy, and the scholastics are still saying, well, knowledge is this thing that Aristotle described and that the Platonists also described, right? And it's kind of unthinkable that knowledge would be anything else, right? But then on the other hand, there's what the folks down at the Royal Society or whatever are doing, which doesn't really seem to correspond to or rise, as it were, to the level of what the philosophers were saying should be knowledge, right? So there's a kind of maybe a period of instability where the epistemology is lagging behind the science, where people assume that knowledge is something that the very impressive scientific like discoveries don't actually match with, right? So my guess is that that created a situation that undermines traditional ideas about epistemology. I think that's a possible hypothesis, but obviously that's kind of beyond my historical specialization. Come back to me in 8 years after I've covered all that in the podcast, and I'll have a firmer view on the matter.
Thank you for the very inspiring talk. My question is this. In some of the parts of the talk, especially those focusing on Assent in Farabi, the impression I got was that in both cases, knowledge and belief, it's assent to propositions,
Yeah.
and we get the truth.
Yeah, that's definitely right.
But in other parts, especially this intellection in Avicenna, I have the impression that we have knowledge and belief of entities.
Yes.
And seeing sounds more like that than like truths. So is it a mutually exclusive case? Do we either see truths or things?
Yeah.
Or do we have both?
That's a
Thank
great question. Yeah, and in fact, one of the key sort of problematic areas of Avicenna's philosophy that maybe still needs some work, although there's a very good, relevant book by Fedor Benovich about essentiality in Avicenna, which goes a long way towards answering this question, but it's in German, so learn German, everybody. So the problem is this, and in fact, this is a problem, kind of a pervasive problem in Aristotelian philosophy, if you think about it. So on the one hand, we have the logical texts, which are telling you, well, here's what knowledge is. It's first principles, and you put them together, you make syllogisms, and you get conclusions, right? And then you can use those conclusions to build further syllogisms. How do you grasp the first principles? Well, you do whatever is being described at the end of the posterior analytics, and that's called nous. Good luck, okay? So there's that. And then there's de anima, where you're told that knowledge is a lot like sensation, and that it's for the soul to be the place of forms and to receive the forms, okay? So now anyone who is working in this tradition has to think about how these two things come together. And what Avicenna does, I take it, is to say that when you grasp a form, in the case of knowledge, what you're doing is grasping the essence. And when you grasp the essence, what you're getting is what he calls all of the constituents of the essence. So for example, by grasping human, you've grasped both animal and rational, okay? Now that's conceptualization. Remember that that's a form of knowledge, right? But the intellect can then put conceptualizations together using demonstrative syllogisms to extract more knowledge. And in fact, he even thinks this is what logic is for, in a sense, is telling you the rules for putting together conceptualizations, which are kind of here playing the role of first principles, to generate more knowledge, right? And so he thinks that those two stories completely coincide. He also thinks you can use logic to analyze what's going on at the level of belief, right? So the assents that aren't this kind of intellectual grasping of forms, but it works completely differently, right? So it would be something like someone told you that something is true, and so you bring that in as a premise, and then you reason on the basis of that. But that's obviously very different from this case where you started out by grasping essences. Actually, in a way, it's good you're asking this, because it's another reason to think that knowledge and belief must be completely different. So knowledge is always starting from a grasp of essences, and beliefs aren't. So if you believe something, by definition, you haven't grasped the essence, right? Because all you're doing is believing it, right? So it's like this thing about having an incomplete conception. And now we're going to find out what all that frowning was about.
It was
Or some
just-
of the frowning.
I was only thinking.
You're just thinking,
all
I'm
I
just
was
thinking with my
doing.
face.
Thank you, Peter. That was great. I'm wondering what happened to wisdom
Ah,
in all of this,
Yeah.
or virtue.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so it's a huge part of the ancient tradition, at least, that the slippage between what we might say about knowledge and what we might say about wisdom, and then in its reincarnation in contemporary epistemology, that comes back to thinking about whatever we might say about virtue. Now, I think probably the contemporary virtue stuff is a red herring, but wisdom in this ancient tradition, I'm sure that you and Rosa are both right about the structure of these bits of the epistemology. But I don't know where the wisdom has gone.
Yeah. I mean, I think this, in a way, goes back to Anna's question, like about the diversity that's possible within this kind of epistemology. Because if you compare Plato to Avicenna, or even Farabi, so Farabi is actually very interested in political philosophy and ethics. Avicenna profoundly is not. I mean, it's the one area of his philosophy where he's not a radical, innovative, unbelievably generative philosopher. So he's thinking about knowledge very much in kind of scientific context. That's what he thinks is we're after. And remember I said that he thinks that ethical beliefs, generally speaking, are just beliefs that you get through testimony and so on, right? You get a more worked out theory in Farabi. Well, sorry, before I get into that, maybe I should say that I think that one of the reasons for this is precisely, in a way, it's thinking through the implications of this radical dichotomy, because now it's starting to sound like knowledge is almost impossibly difficult to have. So if anyone has it, it must be some very special person who's like devoting their entire time to grasping essential truths that are eternal, necessary, right? So this sounds like a specialist, to put it mildly, right? So immediately you've got to worry that if you need to have knowledge in order to like be a good person, then no one's going to be a good person, right? So in this way, in this respect, actually, Avicenna does have a very good answer, because it's, well, that's what my social epistemology is for. So I have an explanation of like why people think it's wrong to murder other people, and it has nothing to do with knowledge, right? Farabi, though, has, in a way, a more interesting thing to say. So what he says is, yes, we need to have some knowledge in the system in order to generate maximal happiness for everyone, but almost no one is a philosopher. So what we need is a philosopher who is a king. So he knows about that. He hasn't read the whole Republic, but he knows that there's supposed to be philosopher kings. He doesn't know about the philosopher queens. Or if he does, he doesn't mention it. And furthermore, this person needs to be able to convince everyone of what they know. And rather than using a noble lie, they use prophecy. So the ideal ruler is a philosopher prophet who knows everything in this kind of hardcore super level, and then presents what they know in the form of a rhetorically persuasive scripture or set of images, as he says, in order to convince everyone else to believe the things they need to believe in order to be as happy as they can be. And he says that the place where that happens, he says, is the virtuous city. And then he also has a whole, I won't trouble you with it, but he has a whole story about what would have to happen when such a person's not available. But he seems to think that wisdom is like the one person who can do this and rule, and often there is no such person at all. Maybe very rarely there would be more than one at a time, but it was an extremely unusual situation to have even one, he thinks. Well, so I think they think that, I mean, there's an Arabic word, wisdom, hikmah, and they actually, when they call Aristotle al-Hakim, the wise one. So, and it even becomes a synonym for philosophy, hikmah. But they tend to, I think they tend to sort of cash that out in highly rationalist terms as like just the grasp of all the essences. And so then actually, for example, what Farabi does with phronesis, practical wisdom, or ta'aqul, so that the function of that is to see how your essential knowledge could be applied to particular situations. So he has to come up with these bridging mechanisms to get from rationalist science to applied wisdom, right? And again, Avicenna doesn't have that much to say about this because he's a scientist, fundamentally. He's a nerd.
Thank you so much, Peter. It's a real treat for Francesca and I to listen to this. And I want to avoid falling into the trap of posing as Rosa's official spokesperson. I think that would be...
Better you than me, though.
Well,
which is what's been happening so far.
Yeah, I may be able to shed a little bit of light on one or two of the questions that came up. I mean, first of all, the first question about whether there's a consistent justification underlying this remarkably long and elastic tradition. I think the fundamental point Rose is making in the first third of the book, the historical portion of the book, is that she's documenting the fact that this is a conception which is shared across multiple languages and cultures. As you said, it's not the words that matter. There's Greek philosophers, Latin philosophers, medieval Latin philosophers, French, Italian, German, English, and so on, who are reproducing this distinction. So it's not about the language, it's not about the culture or even the religion underlying. That it's also common to epistemological rationalists and empiricists, and metaphysical realists and nominalists. In other words, it's not a shared philosophical framework or a tradition in the sense of people modifying one or another authority. So what is it grounded in? The answer to that question, as Rosa provides it, is found in the second section of the book, which starts with the phenomenological analysis of the origins of this distinction. And I'm not going to try to reproduce that here because I'm sure I would make a hash of it. But you need to read the second part of the book in order to understand this historical phenomenon in the first part. As far as where the tradition begins to break down and where we ended up where we are today, I think this is one of the most remarkably compelling aspects of her case. She has a chapter on skepticism where she says that the skeptics agreed with their contemporaries in distinguishing knowledge and belief. The difference is that they didn't believe that we actually were capable of this direct seeing or a grasping of what actually is. And she says, and she casts Hume as a skeptic. So after Hume, within the Anglo sort of American tradition, knowledge is no longer possible, and we're just dealing with species of belief. But of course, we continue to talk about knowledge in common parlance. So then we try to understand what we mean by knowledge. We say it's a species of belief. It's some kind of belief. It's justified true belief plus something. So she very, I think, very persuasively identifies the origin of the position that she's opposing in this canonical figure at the beginning of the.
Yeah, as so often, it's Hume's fault.
As so often, it's Hume's fault. That's right.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I mean, actually, I think that's very important, and maybe I should have mentioned that, is that skeptics also endorse the same epistemology. It's just, I mean, the ancient skeptics, for example, just said to the Stoics, okay, we love your epistemology, not so sure you can actually get any knowledge, though, according to this epistemology. And in a way, you can see that this kind of epistemology is an invitation to skepticism, right? Because it says, oh, here's these two very different kind of phenomena, and mostly you have this, but occasionally we elite philosophers have this, right? Especially here, what we just saw with, I mean, what we were just talking about, the elitism of the version of this view we see in the Arabic world. It's very tempting to say, I don't think you've got that, and I don't think anyone else does either, but we do just fine. We follow the appearances or whatever it is that the skeptics say. And I think it's interesting to think about the way that skepticism too has evolved. Because if you lower the, I mean, think about, like, why do modern day skeptics have to do things like, have you seen The Matrix? To get you to start feeling skeptical, full of skeptical intuition. Why do they need to do that? Well, because now knowledge has become very easy to have, right? So you have to introduce some crazy scenario, like mad scientists, whatever, in order to get people to really feel the pull of global skepticism. Whereas global skepticism, when knowledge was this extremely elite, difficult to achieve phenomenon, that was easy. Like, I've never had that. You know? So I think that's actually a really important point.
We've one more last question here in the middle.
I guess my question is, why isn't what we're now calling assent just belief in the standard account? So it seems to have features that belief has in the standard account. It sounds, belief is plausibly a taking to be true. We then have knowledge as a proper species of assent, which, right? So I mean, the thought would be, we've been translating the wrong word as belief, right? I'm more familiar with the Greek tradition. Don't translate doxa as belief, right? Because of the reasons given. It was hupolepsis all along. That turns out to be what we today would call belief. And so, in a way, these figures have been operating with the standard account. It's just that we've been mistranslating the words, doxa equals belief or what have you.
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. And I mean, in a way, that's the question, right? And I think the answer is that, so again, it shouldn't come down to bickering about terminology, right? And I guess if you want to translate tasdik or hupolepsis as belief, then you can do that as long as you then go on to say, now, bear in mind that under this term, there are two vastly heterogeneous phenomena, which are mutually exclusive, and which, like what we've just seen, are even seated in different cognitive powers, right? So even they're seated in things with different identity conditions, right? So we have the rational soul, which can survive the death of the body, and then we have the brain, which is where the beliefs happen, the beliefs that aren't knowledge, the assents that aren't knowledge. And in particular, there's no, the reason why it's important that they be mutually exclusive is that if they're not, so if you think that knowledge is a subset of belief, the way the standard account has it, then that invites you to think that knowledge is a belief that's somehow been upgraded, right? But as I said, when I was talking about like what would happen if I already believed something and then I wanted to know it, Avicenna's advice would be, well, start over. Forget, if you want, you can forget the fact that, fine, you believe it. Maybe that's motivating you to do a scientific inquiry into it, but it will be of absolutely no relevance going forward, because what you have to do is start out with some completely different way of getting to the knowledge, right? Now, maybe that's something that someone on the standard view could think too, but I think the standard view, as is sort of implied by this JTB plus terminology, it looks like what you're trying to do is sort of build knowledge in kind of Lego way, right? So you start with belief and then
Out of assent, right? It's assent plus.
Well, but it's not, because assent isn't anything other than deeming to be true. So you don't add anything to assent to make it knowledge. Knowledge is a kind of assent. It's not assent plus something, right? Think about the fact, also remember that knowledge can also be conceptualization. Maybe it's clearer in that kind of case, because conceptualization is just, I get what that means, right? So it's not a bad, like another kind of conceptualization plus some kind of upgrading properties. And similarly, if you grasp a first principle or the conclusion of a demonstrative syllogism, that's not like I've assented something to it and then I've added that I'm certain about it or something like that. It's just the fact that you're grasping that thing in the right way, right? So that's what makes it different from the standard account. Does that help? Ish? Okay.
Hello. I'm kind of nervous. I'm very much out of my depth, I can tell. But thank you very much for your work. It's been very elucidating, especially in terms of the Muslim tradition, especially in the West. It's very difficult to find content relating to the likes of Avicenna and Al-Farabi and the like. So thank you very much for that. My question is specifically regarding a certain point in your lecture when you mentioned that Avicenna, he explains that the idea of God not knowing the particulars, he explains it by saying that, if I've understood it correctly, that you have universal concepts and you understand them and you apply them to particulars, as opposed to God just not knowing the particulars. And especially from what I can understand, I may be wrong in saying this, but Al-Ghazali, he makes takfir of those, he excommunicates those beliefs by saying that, he says that if you were to hold these beliefs, you wouldn't be a Muslim. I want to ask, how did contemporaneous scholars react to the sort of reconciliation that you gave of Avicenna's belief regarding God not knowing the particulars? That's what I'd like to ask.
Okay, so generally, so just to make sure everyone heard that. So the question is, I guess the question is, what did other people think about Avicenna's claim that God doesn't know particulars as such, right?
Yes, and how did they react to the explanation?
Right. So, the short answer is they hated it. So it's something that a lot of later thinkers complained about. And one way that but on the other hand, it also pushed them to develop new ideas, or at least to make more precise their ideas about how God would know particulars. And one thing that it pushes them to do is think, well, maybe God, actually it's handy, this is the slide we need still. So maybe knowledge isn't having a form in your mind. Maybe knowledge is having a relation between your mind and the object known. And the advantage of this is that, for example, so they took it that one reason why you wouldn't want to say that God knows particulars as such is that God would have to change. So he'd be getting new forms in his mind all the time, right? And they said, well, what God does is he tracks particulars as they change, but only through a relation. And since relations are extrinsic, God in himself won't have to change. So this is an idea you get in Kalam, even to some extent before and around the time of Avicenna, but they develop it much more elaborately in answer to Avicenna's challenge, which was like, tell me how God could know a particular as such. And what they do is they kind of build out this knowledge as a relation theory. Actually, Fedor and I just put out I'll do a little advertisement. Fedor and I just did a book called The Heirs of Avicenna, which is like 700 pages long and translates all this material from post-Avicennan philosophy. And one of the chapters is about this, about God's knowledge of particulars. So, you can look there if you want to see the whole story.
Great. So thank you very much. Before we thank Peter for a fantastic lecture, I just wanted to mention that to all be looking out, because soon, well, not so soon, unfortunately, but in the summer, at some point, we'll be organizing a conference and a book launch for Thinking with Assent. So Rosa's book, so it's in production now with OEP. So be all out on the lookout for that, and it would be lovely to see all of you there. And with that, just leaves us to thank Peter.